Hi everyone, welcome to MexElects Live on Jacobin. Thanks to Jacobin for accommodating us for the next 24 hours at least. We want to introduce you in this broadcast to the sort of the general terrain of politics in Mexico, who the main candidates are, the parties, what's been happening in Mexico, what's driving this campaign. I'm Colin Mooers. This is Hackbarth. We've been traveling the country for 6 months now,
right.
Covering a variety of stories, everything from the candidacy of the indigenous candidate Marichui in Chiapas up to the border wall in the north, in Tijuana. So let's get started. There are basically four candidates if we include El Bronco, from who's a kind of Trump-like candidate from the state of Nuevo León. He's very low in the polls. Maybe will do well to get 1 or 2% of the vote. The other two major candidates, the PRI candidate, that's the Institutional Revolutionary Party candidate, Jose Antonio Meade, or Meade, depending on which audience he's speaking to. The PRI are currently in power under the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto. The second establishment candidate is Ricardo Anaya for the PAN party, which is a traditional Catholic conservative party in the country. So those are the two major conservative candidates or establishment candidates. They're running respectively Meade at around 21, 22
21%,
percent, Ricardo Anaya at 25 or 26%. He's been falling in the polls in the last month. The final candidate and the leading candidate, the one that everyone is betting on at this stage, is Andres Manuel López Obrador, known here in Mexico as AMLO. He's running anywhere between 20 and 30% points ahead in the polls. So he's been polling around
high 40s, around 50.
Around 50% in the polls. The reason that AMLO is running so far ahead, I mean, this is a guy who's run twice in two previous presidential elections, 2006 and 2012, widely believed to be fraudulent, certainly in 2006 and most likely in 2012. The reason that AMLO's support is so high right now is, I mean, there are just so many things to talk about. The economy, unemployment, poverty, inequality are at record levels in Mexico. Violence, 200,000 people have died in the so-called war on drugs since 2006. Violence is endemic across the country as we speak. Generalized insecurity. There's just a level of rage, and you can't call it anything else. When you talk to people, I mean, we've been going all over the country talking to people, and there is just such a level of hunger for real radical change, sometimes quite a bit to the left of López Obrador and his program. I mean, if anything, he's kind of moderated his program this time around, talking mainly about the need to end corruption. And that is a huge thing in Mexico, but he hasn't talked really that much about reducing inequality by taxing the rich or anything that you might expect from a sort of middle-of-the-road social democratic type of politician like AMLO. Nevertheless, he's soaring in the polls, but there's a lot of nervousness in the country right now about a recurrence of the kind of fraud that we saw in 2006 and 2012. So tell us a little bit about that prospect, Kurt.
Sure. So as Colin said, the last two elections in which AMLO ran were stained by very substantiated allegations of fraud. Could it happen again? A lot of people are saying, well, AMLO is so far ahead that even if they manage to chip, some people are saying 5 or 6%, some people are saying up to triple that, off of his tally, he'll still have enough to get by. That is, AMLO will have a fraud-resistant majority, or fraud-resistant plurality. But there's a lot in play here, so let's talk about the different possibilities of fraud that exist. First of all, there's what's called the pre-fraud, and that is the use of social programs or social poverty programs to condition votes. For example, they go around with programs like Prospera, which is one of the most known anti-poverty programs. It says, well, we'll give you your aid, but please give us a copy of your credential. Please give us your voter credential. Without that, people can't vote.
Right.
So there's the conditioning of votes through social programs, and there's also the outright buying of votes by the giving out of grocery products, of construction materials, sometimes even envelopes full of money. And this is all a problem that we see, of course, in the poorer barrios. We're going to be visiting tomorrow one of the poorest barrios of Mexico City called Ixtapalapa. You'll be joining us. I hope we're going to be observing precincts in conjunction with a team of electoral observers. So there's the whole problem of conditioning votes ahead of time. In 2012, Peña Nieto's campaign overtly bought votes with cards. Electoral fraud has now entered the world of digital technology. These Monex cards or Soriana supermarket cards, some of which had money in it and some of which they didn't, in exchange for votes. So that's a worry. The other worry is the potential of fraud on election day itself. The National Electoral Institute has set up a lot of supposed structures to make sure fraud won't occur, but there are things that can still happen. We've noticed, for example, in a number of states leading up to the election, a number of the poll workers have resigned or been replaced. That's a worry. A number of the party observers from the Morena party, which is AMLO's party, have been switched, have had their precincts switched. This could all create confusion. The Electoral Tribunal has said now that instead of just marking your party with an X, a number of different marks might be possible, which could lead to a whole series of confusion and challenges following the vote, which could hold up, of course, the electoral count on Sunday as well. The other worry is what could happen following the vote. Mexico, at least on paper, has a very advanced electoral law. It has a National Electoral Institute. It has an electoral tribunal dedicated solely to dealing with electoral matters. And the law now is very strict on what are the causes for an annulled election. One of them is overspending. There's a very strict overspending law. Of course, the PRI always manages to get around that. Peña Nieto campaign overspent by many times the limit in the last election, as has been proven, years later. And so there's the worry that the powers that be could attempt to annul the election several weeks later, once the electoral observers have gone home and things have gotten all back to normal. And if you talk to people on the streets, this is a real worry. People say, yeah, he's ahead, but will they let him win? And at this point, as Colin said very well, AMLO's lead is so large against his opponents, Anaya and Meade. Really, his opponents now aren't human. They're not his physical contenders. It's the worries about fraud, right? And that's something that people will be very pending for. And I think the other worry is, well, maybe AMLO will win, but will he get a majority in Congress? And that's really very close right now. His party is very new, so it's quite an amazing thing that he's been able to create a party in just about 4 years that could very well take power by this time tomorrow, Morena. Unfortunately, to do that, he's kind of had to create some kind of coalitions with the devil, accept some people from other parties, candidates from other parties, former members of the PAN, former members of the PRI. He's also made an alliance, an actual electoral alliance with a far-right evangelical party called the Partido de Encuentro Social, el PES. This was very highly questioned as well. So, a lot of people say this is what AMLO had to do in a system that's that corrupt and with so much against him. He had to do what he had to do. But, what will that do on election night, and what will that do to his capacity to govern afterwards?
Especially around important social issues like abortion rights, gay and lesbian rights, and so forth, when one of your allies is a conservative evangelical party,
right.
How free is he going to be to actually address these kinds of issues as well?
That's true, and I think AMLO himself has never been very progressive on social issues.
Yeah.
He's always been hard, and we've attended a lot of AMLO's rallies. Really, the strongest, the most progressive part of his speeches are when he says he's attacking neoliberalism, attacking how that's worn away at the Mexican state over the last 30 years and created this enormous kleptocracy. Yeah. There's no other way about it. Yeah. The Peña Nieto administration has taken corruption in Mexico to an absolute new level.
Yeah.
There was the White House scandal where his wife received a house from one of his favorite contractors. It turns out that Peña Nieto plagiarized his college thesis. A number of PRI governors have been caught in scandals of inexplicable enrichment, of using the power of government for their own contracts. Let's move in here.
Yeah.
Of inexplicable enrichment, of using the power of government to benefit their own cronies and buddies. Up to 15 ex-governors of the PRI are either on the lam or in some area of the judicial system. I mean, this idea of the new PRI, which Peña Nieto tried to inaugurate in 2012, has really become the old PRI, but worse. So it's taken this idea of technocrats and turned it into an absolute kleptocracy. And that's what's really fueling this desire for change, you know? So AMLO is strong on that. The problem is, as Colin said, he's really moderated in the sense of, in 2014, the state oil industry, Pemex, which was the great symbolic expropriation of President Lázaro Cárdenas in 1938, was part privatized. AMLO has not promised to roll that back. He said, well, we're going to review the contracts. What he has promised to roll back is a neoliberal educational reform passed a few years ago, which really punishes teachers, attacks unions, and is really kind of a backdoor to school privatization. He's been strong on that. He's also been strong on the recent presidential executive orders, which essentially privatize water. Which essentially privatizes water. Sorry for the musical chairs here. It started to rain up here on the roof. We wanted to get you guys a view of Mexico City. So he's been strong on the privatization of water issue, but everything else, he's really not promised to do anything else to really reverse 30 years of privatizations in Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. And still in all, this really hasn't prevented people from supporting AMLO, but in a very realistic way. I mean, one of the things that we've seen at the rallies when we do sort of vox populi, talk to people afterwards, is, as I said earlier, people's views tend to be to the left of AMLO's, I would say.
Certainly the base of Morena, absolutely.
Yeah, the base of Morena. But they recognize that, in an electoral field like the existing one, there's just no question who you're going to vote for. And the real hope is, I think, by many, many thousands of those activists, that if you have a robust party social movement like Morena, and that's the other thing worth noting, is that Morena is a new party, but in many senses it's a social movement as well. We were at AMLO's closing rally the other night, and there's just tens of thousands of people who have been working in the trenches for years in a variety of different social movements, and the hope is that those movements will remain strong enough to push the López Obrador government further to the left. Whether that comes to pass or not, of course, we don't know. But certainly that's the hope of many thousands of Morena activists.
And what's really interesting here is, in Mexico, as Colin has said, there are essentially two main right-wing parties, the PRI and the PAN. These are nominally separate parties, but when it's always come down to it, the PRI and the PAN have supported each other. And it's called the PRIAN. Basically, that's AMLO's term for them. So in the 1988 election, which saw Carlos Salinas de Gortari snatch the election away from Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, it was the PAN which legitimated the election at that time. Then in 2006, when Calderon snatched the election away from López Obrador the first time, the PRI stepped in and legitimated the election. This time, this vaunted behind-the-scenes alliance of the PRI and the PAN has broken down. The PRI and the PAN, up until today, have been fighting with each other. So it's been fun to see the left, or the center-left, pretty much united behind AMLO, and to watch the right split between the PRI and the PAN. We do have a comment here that I'd like to address, and that is about this comparisons with Chavez, Chavez. This goes back to 2006, when the PAN at that time created what is now the infamous spot of AMLO is a peligro para Mexico. AMLO is a danger for Mexico. And that was unfortunately effective. It was kind of Mexico's first experience with spots and negative ads. They've tried that again this year with much less success. Mexico is a very young population. You've got a population dominated by 18 to 29-year-olds who have no memory of Chavez. And it's basically the PRI and the PAN's campaigns have been so bad that they've really basically tried to rerun the 2006 campaign 12 years later. They've also tried to tie AMLO to Russia, following kind of the Hillary Clintonite Democrats in the States. This idea of Andrés Manuelovich. This also hasn't really gone anywhere, as Mexicans are not as prone to red baiting and Cold War hysteria, fortunately, as Americans seem to be. So that's kind of the setup. We're going to be on tomorrow morning early, broadcasting from Ixtapalapa in Mexico City. So please join us tomorrow. We're going to be broadcasting throughout the day and into the evening. There's going to be an early count of results, early more or less, that should start about 11 o'clock. So join us tomorrow on MexElects here in Jacobin.
See you then.